Good morning. Welcome. We are in Acts 25 this morning. And again, we're going to cover this entire chapter. At least that's our plan. This, by the way, if you're using the Pew Bible, is on page 146. So feel free to grab a copy there. And join us at Acts chapter 25. You'll recall what's happened, just to get our minds back into the story here. Paul was in Jerusalem, and he's been carried off from Jerusalem for his own protection by Lysias, the tribune, the Roman tribune, to Caesarea. And he's been in Caesarea, where he stood trial before the governor, whose name was Felix. We talked a little bit about Felix last week. He'd been the governor there since the year 51. He was appointed by Claudius, the emperor. He was actually a sure-tail relative of Claudius, and it was probably a little bit of an insider connection there that got him that appointment. But Felix was otherwise not well respected and was eventually fired 2 years after this trial. So he stood trial. Basically, Paul was acquitted before Felix, but Felix never got around to rendering the verdict. You know that there's a presumption of innocence. That was true of Roman citizens in the ancient world as much as it is in our system of jurisprudence, which means the burden of proof is on the complaining party. The complaining party had to overcome that, what's sometimes called preponderance of the evidence. They didn't do it. They didn't have any evidence to actually convict Paul, and Paul was able to successfully resist the attack that was brought to bear against him in this setting of court. Felix, however, rather than reaching the verdict, which he should have, took the case under advisement. He was ostensibly waiting for Lysias to come with possible further evidence, which is never recorded as actually having happened. The real story here, presumably, is that Felix is trying to play this for whatever political advantage he can. He knows that somehow Paul is really important. If nothing else, he wants to continue in the good graces as much as possible of the Jewish leadership by keeping Paul in prison for no good reason. At the same time, he's thinking if Paul can scrape together a bribe that's attractive enough, Felix would certainly grab the money and let Paul go. He's willing to go either way, but right now, this is until he gets this bribe, which he never did. The best advantage he can get out of this is simply to keep Paul there, as it were, on ice. And so that's what's happened. And Paul has now been languishing for 2 years in prison. So he's there from the year 58 spring to sometime in the spring of 60. Which is a critical time, really, in the whole history of Rome. This is really when Nero began to show his true colors, but just barely. We think of Nero as this madman, this megalomaniac, and rightly so, but that was not the way he was perceived at the beginning. And we're really still in the time when Nero was viewed as a pretty good emperor. And so but it's just right at the tail end of that time. So 60 AD is a fairly critical moment in the whole history of the first century. Well, Paul has been there. If you look at verse 27 of chapter 24, after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And since he wanted to grant the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So that's where we left it last week. Paul has been there now 2 years. And let's go ahead and read this chapter. This is chapter 25, beginning at verse 1. 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the leaders of the Jews gave him a report against Paul. They appealed to him and requested, as a favor to them against Paul, to have him transferred to Jerusalem. They were in fact planning an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, "Let those of you who have the authority come down with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them accuse him." After he'd stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem surrounded him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Paul said in his defense, I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against the emperor." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there before me on these charges?" Paul said, "I am appealing to the emperor's tribunal. This is where I ought to be tried. I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Now, if I'm in the wrong and have committed something for which I deserve to die, I am not trying to escape death. But if there is nothing to these charges against me, no one can turn me over to them. I appeal to the emperor." Then Festus, after he conferred with his council, replied, "You've appealed to the emperor? To the emperor you will go." After several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to welcome Festus. Since they were staying there several days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a man here who was left in prison by Felix. When I arrived in Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews informed me about him and asked for a sentence against him. I told them it was not the custom of the Romans to hand anyone over before the accused had met the accusers face to face and had been given an opportunity to make a defense against the charges. So when they met here, I lost no time, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they did not charge him with any of the crimes that I was expecting. Instead, they had certain points of disagreement with him about their religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, but Paul said he was alive. Since I was at a loss as to how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wished to go to Jerusalem and be tried there on these charges. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of his imperial majesty, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to the emperor." Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," he said, "you will hear him." So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then Festus gave the order, and Paul was brought in. And Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish community petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And when he appealed to his imperial majesty, I decided to send him. But I have nothing definite to write to our sovereign about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner without indicating the charges against him." So there's our text of the morning. Let's ask God's blessing on our reflection on it. Father, we're grateful that once again you give us another chapter in this unfolding drama. We thank you for the apostle, for his courage. We thank you that these circumstances that surrounded him give us opportunities to see how faith works. We pray that our reflection on these incidents would cause us in our own way to embrace anew our love for and determination to follow and obey the Lord Jesus Christ, our King, in whose name we pray. Amen. Okay, again, quite a bit to cover, but I think we can do it. This chapter goes pretty rapidly, really, and I think we can just kind of sail along here. But we've got 3 days after Festus arrived in the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and leaders of the Jews gave him a report against Paul. I indicated to you that Felix had been there a total of 9 years, and then he was fired. He was fired because there was just a growing crescendo of complaint against him by the Jewish leadership. He was a man who was unstable. He was given to outbursts of wrath and anger. He was corrupt to the core. He would take bribes. Bribes, rather, with a B, bribes, not brides. He would was given to gratuitous acts of violence and so on, and it was just becoming intolerable, so that finally he was yanked back to Rome by the leadership there. He actually apparently was about to stand trial. In other words, there were those of the Jewish leadership who intended to bring testimony against him in a Roman court for his malfeasance. Josephus tells us that that trial apparently never happened, although a contingent of leaders from the Jewish community did go to Rome for that very purpose. But apparently Felix was able to pay off somebody and escape the executioner there. So we don't know what happened to him from there. He kind of fades into the backdrop of history. The fellow that comes replacing him then is this guy named Porcius Festus. Very little is known about him. Tacitus has nothing to say about him. Josephus gives us the only independent collateral information about him. Josephus gives him a pretty good review, but indicates that he was fairly young and inexperienced. He seems to have been a good man, a principled man, probably a competent man, but he had not had many years to kind of develop these skills, but he sort of shot to the top quickly. And so this was a bit of a risk to put Festus in this role, but he seemed as if he might be up to the task. And so he's installed there to replace Felix. As we look at the way the story unfolds, it appears that the Jewish leaders were probably hoping they could take advantage of the lack of experience of Festus. And some of the things they attempt to do here seem to reflect that particular idea, that maybe they could catch Festus a little bit off guard, and before he'd really figured out what the score was, be able to get their hands on Paul once again, because really they just wanted to do away with Paul, and Festus was their main obstacle to that, and yet maybe Festus didn't quite understand, so it seems as if that was their intention. Festus, in any event, shows up in Caesarea. He immediately goes to Jerusalem. He's the new kid on the block. He knows the recent history of Felix. He knows that things are politically tense right now. Felix had engendered a lot of negative sentiment, both toward Felix and toward Rome. And while Rome was a totalitarian regime, they nevertheless liked to keep their client states in some kind of, happy, amicable relationship. They didn't like revolts. They liked order. They liked peace. And to some extent, they liked to give regions their autonomy. And so this was a thorny problem. And Festus was coming partly to be a governor, partly to be a diplomat, and try to smooth things over. So he wastes no time going from Caesarea straight to Jerusalem, which is the real moral capital. Caesarea is the political capital with Roman authority, but Jerusalem obviously is the real capital. And so he goes there to meet the leadership and to try to get off on the best foot, try to make as much positive impression as he can right off the bat. So he goes to Jerusalem for that very purpose. And of course, you can imagine that there was a punch list of complaints that the Jewish leadership had. Most of these had accumulated from the time that Felix was there. And so this was Festus' opportunity to begin addressing some of the grievances. And they're ticking off, and high on the list was this matter of Paul. This was probably not the only thing they were unhappy about, but they were hoping to sort of knock over some of these issues with Festus quickly, and Paul was right up there on the list. So they make a report concerning Paul, among other things, presumably, and they requested as a favor to them against Paul to have him transferred to Jerusalem. You can see what they're doing. Just a little favor. There's no big deal. This is guy Paul. He's in prison there. We really should be trying him here in Jerusalem. You shouldn't mess with this. Festus, why don't you just simplify your life a little bit, and it'd be a nice way to do us a favor and kind of get off on a good start with us. Just give him back to us. What do you say? And they were hoping that Festus, before he'd really thought this through, before he'd really known the background of it, or all that went into this story, would just simply, as a little concession, maybe give them this bone, as it were, give them Paul. That seems to be the spirit of this thing. Now, they don't mention this. Luke, of course, advises us, as we were aware, they were, in fact, planning an ambush to kill him along the way. There was no interest here in getting Paul back in Jerusalem so he could have a fair trial. Normal due process was not what was in their minds. They were just trying to get Paul out from under Roman protection so that the assassin's dagger could find him somewhere along the way, and they could fix that problem once and for all. They didn't mention that to Festus. They weren't going to tell him that was the skullduggery that they had in the back of their minds. They're just simply trying to make this a kind of minimal thing, just a small thing. Just give Paul back to us, and you don't need to worry about him. Well, Festus shows a little bit of mettle here, because even though he was probably tempted to do that and may not have known exactly why he shouldn't, something in his tummy told him this wasn't quite right. We don't know the whole story, but Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea. This is a decision that he's making. No, I think we'll keep Paul right where he is. Presumably Festus didn't know the whole story. We don't know that. I'm just guessing here, but later narrative suggests he may not have been fully aware of the entire history here. But something about the request just struck him wrong, and he said, no, I think we'll keep Paul in Caesarea for the time being. I'm certainly willing to hear the arguments, hear the complaints, but not quite willing to just gratuitously turn him over to you without any further ado. And he indicated that he intended to go there shortly himself. And so he said, verse 5, let those of you who have the authority come down with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them accuse him. I'm certainly willing to hear your complaints, Festus is saying. If you want to make your presentation, present your case, then I'm certainly open to it. We don't know at this point if Festus was aware that Paul had already stood trial 2 years earlier, that essentially the trial had been ongoing now in an extended recess for 2 years, that Felix should have given a verdict and didn't. And now this protracted period of time, while Paul's waiting, you see, for the judgment of the court, and nothing's happened. Festus may or may not have been aware of that, but in any event, he's going to at least adhere to the Roman standards of due process that apply to a Roman citizen. So, you can come, make your case, and we'll dispose of the matter from there. Okay, verse 6. After he had stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. So he stays in Jerusalem about a week, a little more. Then he goes back to Caesarea, which is the political, the Roman center of the Roman authority there. The next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. So obviously this was fairly important. The very next day, Festus is going to address the matter. He doesn't want this to just go on pointlessly. He's the kind of guy that likes to clean things up, tidy up loose ends. This is a very conspicuous loose end that needs to be dealt with. So the next day, he takes his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem surrounded Paul, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. So this should be a little bit like deja vu. Last week we saw the same kind of thing happening. These leaders from Jerusalem came, made many serious charges, but they offered no proof. The mere allegation doesn't prove anything. In that case, Tertullus, you recall, had given an eloquent speech and tried to persuade Felix, but Paul was able to rebut their case basically just by denying it. You see, the burden of proof is on the complaining party. They have to overcome a simple denial by affirmative proof, and they just didn't have it. Here, again, it's the same sort of thing. They're simply making a lot of accusations. They're making a lot of noise, generating a lot of heat, but as we say, not much light. And Festus, they're hoping, is simply going to be moved by this avalanche, this barrage of verbiage. That's going to be all it takes. That tactic sometimes works, Smoke and mirrors in the courtroom. They're just thinking if we shout loud enough and act outraged enough and just get furious enough that we can move the judge. And so without any proof, they just get real mad, and make a lot of noise and hope that maybe Festus, inexperienced as he is, will think to himself, boy, this guy must really be bad because look at how furious these people are, and kind of, fall off the edge just by virtue of that. And so that seems to be what's going on. That tactic did work, by the way, when Jesus of Nazareth was on trial for his life. The crowd just simply is in an uproar. There's no proof. He wasn't, convicted of any crime. Manifestly, there was no crime that he could be convicted of. Pontius Pilate is aware of that. What's the man done? I don't see. What has he done deserving death? But the people simply put such political pressure on him that as a matter of pure expediency, he just says, okay, uncle, I wash my hands of this. It's your problem. Take him, That's the way Pontius Pilate did. Well, Festus wasn't. He was a better man. Then again, Jesus was not a Roman citizen, and Paul was. So that may have played into Festus's concern as well. there was a greater concern for protecting his legal rights than there would have been for a non-citizen. But anyway, all of this kind of furor is aroused concerning Paul, but Festus is not moved by it. Paul is given an opportunity to speak in his own defense, verse 8, and he simply says, I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against the emperor, suggesting that the charges against Paul could be classified probably into those three areas. That Paul had violated the laws of the Jews in some way or other. That he had violated the temple, profaned the sacred precincts, or possibly violated the law of Rome. Three kinds of charges. But of course, all of them without any proof. So Paul simply does a denial. I deny it. I haven't violated any laws of the Jews, either in Jerusalem or anywhere. I haven't profaned the temple. I certainly haven't violated the laws of Rome. And that simple denial is enough, then, to push the burden back on the complaining party, and they have no further proof that they can afford. Now, Festus is probably thinking at this point, well, maybe the whole problem here is that if this trial were in Jerusalem, then both sides could tender to the court some real evidence. Obviously, here we are some miles away from the proper venue for a consideration of these in terms of the availability of witnesses and so on. It might simply be better to have this case take place in Jerusalem. And as far as Festus knows, Paul might be open to that idea. He's not going to ram it down Paul's throat. He's not going to force Paul to go to Jerusalem. But maybe Paul's willing to go to Jerusalem. Festus, at any event, explores that. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, wanting to be the nice guy here, not wanting to unnecessarily arouse their negative disposition toward him, asked Paul, well, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there before me, I would still be the judge, on these charges? Again, Festus doesn't know that there's a plan to kill Paul. He's not aware of that. And so he's thinking that maybe Paul would be open to that, and that would kind of solve this little problem. It would make the Jewish people happy because for some reason they really want Paul to go back to Jerusalem. And maybe Paul would be okay with that. And then Festus would be off the horns of this difficulty he's facing. Well, Paul surprised him with his response. He said, I am appealing to the emperor's tribunal, which is a way of saying to Roman jurisdiction. Even though you would be my judge back in Jerusalem, the fact of the matter is this is the proper venue for a hearing that takes place under Roman jurisdiction. And I'm clinging to that. I'm under Roman jurisdiction. I'm appealing to it. I'm hanging on to it. And that means going to Jerusalem is not a necessary aspect of that kind of proceeding. He says, this, that is in Caesarea, is where, or in the Roman tribunal at least, is where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Pretty bold on Paul's part. I think he's saying that because now Festus has heard enough. He's heard all the kind of avalanche of allegations from the complainers. He's heard Paul's simple denial on all points. He knows that there's not enough information before Festus or evidence to render a verdict against him. Festus may even be aware, and presumably this information has come out, and Festus may have already known, that there had been a prior trial, that in fact this hearing was simply a continuation of the same trial, now 2 weeks or 2 years later. And all of that should lead to Festus, rationally concluding, there's no case here. Granted, you guys don't like him, but sorry, there's no basis to proceed, and Paul appeals to that as he thinks should be a given at this point. You know very well that no evidence has been produced by which I could be properly convicted. Now he says, if I am in the wrong and have committed something for which I deserve to die, I am not trying to escape death. Paul has no objection to facing capital punishment if it is deserved. He, in fact, has no objection in principle to capital punishment. He's a Jew. The Jewish tradition certainly embraced the notion of capital punishment. His own treatment of that subject in Romans 13, or at least the power of the civil magistrate to use the sword, confirms that point. So Paul's not saying, I'm unwilling to die if I'm capitally guilty. But I'm not capitally guilty. That's the problem here, you see. I haven't done any crime that warrants the infliction of that kind of punishment. And so I'm not trying to escape death if there's reason for it. But if there is nothing to these charges against me, no one can turn me over to them. I appeal to the emperor. I appeal to the emperor. Ever since the Roman Republic had been established in 509 BC, there was a right among Roman citizens to appeal, not to the emperor, because they didn't have one then, but to the people. If you know Roman history, you know that the story goes that Romulus founded Rome, right? A name for Romulus. He killed his twin brother Remus, Romulus and Remus. I've always thought those are good names for a couple of cats. Romulus and Remus. So if you ever have a couple of cats and you need names, those are good. But anyway, Romulus killed his brother and became the founder then of the Roman city in about the year 750. And for a period of time, Rome had a series of kings. But things didn't go well with Rome under monarchy. And that's part of what's very distinct about Roman history, is that at a certain point they repudiated monarchy and established probably the most advanced expression of what we would call a republic, and what they called a republic of the ancient world. That was about 509 BC. And one of of course, there's many aspects to that whole notion of how they arranged their government, but one particular aspect of it was this. If a person was on trial, a citizen, that is of Rome, was on trial, and the proceeding, for whatever reason, seemed to be either unfair or inappropriate or whatever objection the defendant might have in the process, that person always had the right at any point to appeal to the people, meaning that he could have representatives of the people themselves come in, as it were, and become a jury to evaluate what was going on and to handle the case. So it really prevented sort of secret trials, insider trials that were not open, in open court, as it were. That'd be the classical way of expressing that notion. And so that could take place whether or not there'd been a verdict. If a person was on trial, even before the verdict had been reached, they could always appeal to the people. Now, later, of course, Rome became an empire, technically, really, with Julius Caesar. Although you'll notice all the Caesars, they never used the name king. They were opposed to that. They didn't have kings. And so the Caesars, including Julius, wouldn't use the name king. They would always simply say that they were the first citizen. Well, arose by any other name. I think you understand that. But nevertheless, the rule changed there then with the Caesars, so that instead of appealing straight to the people, a defendant could appeal to the Caesar at any point. It's a very remarkable thing. The only thing I can say in terms of likening this to an American analogy, you might say, would be if there were a certain class of people in our society that we called citizens, and if they were ever accused of a crime, if they had the right at any point along the way, whether or not there'd been a verdict returned yet, to appeal to the Supreme Court. You see, that ends it. That's the end of it. The whole thing gets transferred to the Supreme Court of the United States and will be disposed of. There's a remarkable kind of privilege. It was rarely used. It wasn't as if everybody was just scrambling for an opportunity to get in front of the Caesar. But nevertheless, it was there, and Paul now kind of plays that card, which is a very remarkable thing, but obviously he knew he could. And the reason for doing it was not so much that at this point he was really excited to get in front of the Caesar, but simply because I think he probably saw Festus waffling. I think he saw at least the possibility that Festus was going to cave in to this pressure and agree to have Paul go back to Jerusalem, even over Paul's objections. And Paul knew that was probably going to be not good for his own health. And so he invokes that privilege And that, of course, stops the action right there. That solves Festus's problem right there on the spot, and he's out from under the difficulty. Festus confers with his council. This is a small group of advisors that are there to give him advice legally. And then he replies, "Okay, you win. You've appealed to the emperor. To the emperor you will go." The emperor at this time is Nero. We, in retrospect, wonder why would anybody appeal to Nero, and think, if you know anything about his life, he's one of the most ghastly and horrific characters to ever grace the history of monarchical rule. But up until this time, Nero had really not shown those colors. He became the emperor in 54 on the death of Claudius, his stepfather, who was poisoned by Nero's mother, but he became the emperor as a teenager and was still under the tutelage of some pretty good people. The Stoic philosopher Seneca was one of his teachers. Burrus, another well-respected teacher, cared for Nero during these years. And really, Nero himself showed a great deal of native genius. He was widely, reputed as possibly going to be the greatest emperor who had ever sat on the imperial throne. And it was really almost viewed in some ways at the time as the beginning of a golden age for Rome. And this highly enlightened emperor, Nero, was going to, really lead the country into an entirely new chapter, as it were, of sophistication and success. And so that was really the view. And so at this point, now Paul, I think, knew the handwriting was on the wall. He had some idea that things were going to go from bad to worse. Certainly others of his writings betrays a notion that he knew that great cataclysmic times were coming. He's had probably from the prophetic insight alone, he was able to recognize all of those things. But nevertheless, we can understand in a purely human way why he might make this appeal now to Nero. Nero did begin spiraling out of control in the next couple of years. And by 64, of course, it's a very bloody summer in Rome, and that's when part of Rome burned, and Nero blamed the Christians, and that whole story takes place. But we're ahead of that by about 4 years at this point. So, Paul appeals to the emperor, and the decision is that he can do that. So that's the outcome there. Brings us to verse 13. After several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to welcome Festus. All right, King Agrippa. This is King Agrippa II. There's another King Agrippa who shows up in the book of Acts. That's King Agrippa I. He has a play in Acts chapter 12. He is not regarded as a very nice guy. He's the one that reached out to harass the church, as you recall, in Acts chapter 12. He executed James and otherwise, and imprisoned Peter. You recall, he was the one that was going to execute Peter the next day, and Peter was released from prison by miraculous, angel that came and sprung him. You remember that story? And then Agrippa himself hears an outpouring of the people in Caesarea on another occasion. They're giving him a kind of expression of worship, elevating him almost to the status of a deity. Agrippa should have deferred at that point. He didn't. And Luke tells us that God struck him and that he died this loathsome death. Well, that's the father of Agrippa II. So Agrippa II, who's the guy we're looking at here, his dad had died that very ghastly death. Agrippa II was 17 years old at the time of the death of his father. Agrippa I actually had jurisdiction in Judea, and there was some thought of putting Agrippa, his son, into that place. But Roman wisdom on the subject said, Judea is such a politically ticklish and thorny situation. We're just going to leave that position vacant for the time being and not have a Roman ruler, a king. We're just going to have it under a governor. And so a governor comes in, and that's where Felix, shows up. And so we have Agrippa, though, of course, has rights to some kind of rule. So Agrippa is placed on a throne of a dominion up in the region of Lebanon. And he did very well and was was highly respected and was quite successful and showed a great deal of competence. So his empire actually expanded, this kind of puppet empire, in which he then, by the time of the incident here in 60 A.D., he had fairly vast authority, but he still did not have authority in Judea. So when he comes to welcome Festus, he does not come in any sense as Festus's boss. He's not here in authority over Festus in any sense. His jurisdiction is elsewhere. So this is merely a cordial visit, welcoming the new guy to town, you see. And that's the kind of thing kings do. You understand? They go around and kind of PR guys. And so this is what he's doing. He's welcoming Festus to town, and this is purely cordial. He is in accompaniment with Bernice. Luke is very sort of, what would you say, just tactful here. He doesn't say anything about Bernice. He doesn't say it's his wife. He doesn't say she's the queen. He just says, and Bernice. There was a huge scandal at the time connected with Bernice, because actually Bernice was the full sister of Agrippa II. And she had been married, and her husband had died, and she thereafter then wound up with her brother Agrippa. The word on the street was that they were living together in an incestuous relationship. That was never proven. Josephus just takes it for granted. He's blistering in his critique of Agrippa and Bernice, and yet, in fact, the judgment of history is that, well, it's not altogether clear, but probably was true. At least they didn't go to any trouble to deny that rumor, and it seems as if it was likely the case. So there was that little cloud over Agrippa II. He traveled now with Bernice, coming to Caesarea to welcome Festus. All right, verse 14. Since they were staying there several days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there's a certain man who was left in prison by Felix. Now we're going to have this kind of lengthy recitation by Festus of the history of this case. And the first thing he does is mention that Paul had been left there by Felix. The reason probably that Festus raised the subject of Paul with Agrippa was because Agrippa was well known as an expert in Jewish law. He was interested in the subject. He was regarded as being fairly well educated and fairly sophisticated on the subject of the way in which Jewish law operates. He had always wanted to be the king in Judea, and in a sense was constantly studying in preparation for that capacity. You see, so it was like an ambition of his, and that caused him to take special interest in Judean history and polity, if you will. And so Agrippa is an expert. And Festus is thinking to himself, well, this is good, because I'm somewhat at a loss with respect to Paul. He's appealed to Caesar. I have to send him to Caesar. I have a responsibility as the governor to reduce to writing the factual and procedural history of this case and identify what are the charges that have been brought to bear against this man, and give my own assessment of the case. And the fact is I'm clueless. I don't really understand why the charges are and what to say. And so he's hoping that maybe Agrippa can help him sift out and distill what are the essentials so that Festus won't look like an idiot when he writes his report that goes off to the Caesar. So Festus views this as a bit of a happy fortuity that Agrippa's in town and can hopefully give him that kind of help. So verse 15 then, when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me about him, asked for a sentence against him. He's just giving the history. We've already seen that. I told them that it was not the custom of the Romans to hand over anyone before face to face. Until he'd met the... Let's do that again. It was not the custom of the Romans to hand over anyone before the accused had met the accusers face to face and had been given an opportunity to make a defense against the charge. Basic idea of due process. If you are accused, then it seems only fundamental fairness should dictate that you have an opportunity to confront your accuser. We've certainly enshrined that notion in our own American constitutional theories. The idea of being able to confront your accusers. face to face to cross-examine them, you see. It seems to us to be a given, that that's just essential to a fair trial. When we adopted that outlook as Americans in the constitutional setting, that is the framing of the Constitution, we were objecting to and quite consciously reacting to what was called in England the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber was a king's court. It was outside the common law. And in the Star Chamber, it was like a private trial. People could be accused and convicted, and the thing never was exposed to public scrutiny. This was specially used with respect to religious dissenters, you see. And one of the little features of the Star Chamber in England was that you could be accused, tried, and convicted based on accusations from anonymous sources. Now fancy that. You're on trial, and all you have is a naked allegation against you from somebody, you don't know who it is, and yet it just, on its own steam is there accusing you. That really, I think, struck everybody at the time of the framing of the American Constitution as a manifestly unfair state of affairs. And so we obviously included this idea we should be able to confront our accusers in an open trial in open court, that idea. Well, we didn't invent that. We Americans weren't the first ones to dream that up. That's been around for as long as there's been any idea of a fair trial. And that's exactly, of course, what Festus is invoking here, is that principle, which certainly was well defined in Roman law, that if you've been accused, you should have an opportunity in a public forum to confront the accuser, to ask the hard questions, and see whether there's any holes in that case that otherwise seem so strong against you. So, verse 17 then. So when they met here, I lost no time, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. So again, Festus is detailing, we've seen, of course, that history already. When the accusers stood up, they did not charge him with any of the crimes that I was expecting. Yeah. With all of the fury surrounding Paul, Festus was expecting he would be accused of being a malefactor of, great proportions, a murderer, an insurrectionist, some kind of terrible criminal. And Festus is himself buffaloed when he finds out this whole thing has to do with some kind of technical points about the law and profaning the temple or something. And then there's this fellow Jesus, and how does he figure into it? And Festus really seems to be completely lost in the whole deal. Verse 19, instead they had certain points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. And again, it doesn't appear that Festus had much information about this Jesus, whoever that was. But he knew that something about he's dead, but Paul says he's alive. And, it's like Festus is sort of dismissive of the whole thing. He probably is not familiar with the Christian movement. He's only recently from Rome. There is a Roman church at this time. Paul wrote to that church in 57, 58 A.D. from Corinth. We've talked about that earlier. But probably that church had not really had a major impact on the city yet. And it's perfectly likely that Festus himself was quite unfamiliar with the Christian movement, and so he's reflecting something of that ignorance here. In good faith. He wasn't necessarily expected to know all of these things, but he realizes that there's some kind of strange allegations and counter-allegations connected with this fellow Jesus. Since I was at a loss as to how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wished to go to Jerusalem and be tried there on these charges. Again, just giving us the history. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of his imperial majesty, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to the emperor. So again, Festus just giving Agrippa the story, and this is all familiar to us at this point. Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you will hear him. Now, it's highly likely that while Festus was uninformed about the Christian movement, Agrippa was very well informed about it. Agrippa probably had a huge amount of history in his mind about this fellow Jesus. He knew his grandfather, Herod the Great, was probably aware of the massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem. that had occurred. I mean, this was big stuff, and Agrippa II was fairly up to speed on all of that, knew about the Christian movement, knew about the crucifixion of Christ, knew the stories that were circulating that he had risen from the dead. Agrippa was probably quite familiar with Paul. He maybe never met him, presumably had not, but nevertheless, certainly had heard of him. He was a famous guy, and so there's every reason to think that Agrippa views this as a very happy occasion to finally confront and meet this fellow about whom he's had some interesting reports, and just to satisfy his curiosity. Probably Agrippa thought this was a really remarkable and lucky thing for him, that it just so happens that Paul, about whom he's been hearing these rumors, is right here, and he has an opportunity to hear him for himself. Now, I'm speculating, you understand that, but there's some likelihood, knowing what we know about Agrippa, that would be the case. All right, verse 23. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. So you can imagine the regal splendor. You see that here's Bernice, all dressed up, and here's Agrippa looking very kingly, and of course Festus dressed in his very best, and some of the prominent men of the city. This is kind of a deal, they're all there, and this is going to be a kind of a public meeting, and these people are strutting their stuff, so to speak. Paul, for his part, is there in chains, wearing prison garb. The difference in status socially would be pretty evident to anybody immediately. They'd be impressed with the striking dissimilarity between the pomp and circumstance related to the king on the one hand and poor Paul on the other. I really think, now I'm way out on a limb speculating here, but I really suspect that Luke is mentioning this point about the great pomp just to hopefully suggest to us the great irony of this situation, you see. Paul seems to be the little guy. He seems to be the no count here. Prison garb, chains, humble. This king and queen and all of the pomp and the circumstance and all of that sort of thing would seem to suggest that in the average, evaluation humanly, there are the important people and the not so important people. And yet, isn't it interesting? We're now here 2,000 years down the road talking about this scene. 2,000 years later, we're talking about it. If I were to go out on the streets of Spokane and randomly walk up to people and ask them the question, have you ever heard of the Apostle Paul? Now, I hate to admit it, there's probably some who hadn't, but I think most of us would grant that most people have at least heard of there's churches in Spokane named for the Apostle Paul, for crying out loud. They've probably at least heard of Paul, and some people would be quite familiar with Paul and know that he was a Christian in the first century and wrote part of the Bible and that kind of thing. They'd know that, even if they didn't go to church much, you see. They'd recall something of that they'd picked up along the way. How many people do you suppose, if I went out and asked the question on the sidewalk of Spokane somewhere, who was Bernice? How about Agrippa? Festus? Now, I bet most people would never heard of any of them. If they had, and I imagine there would be some people who had heard of them, why? Why would they have heard 2,000 years later of Bernice or Agrippa or Festus? Reason? Because one day out of their life, they crossed paths with the Apostle Paul, you see. And while at the moment it seemed that all of the importance was sort of concentrated on one end of the room, in the greater scheme of things, they were of negligible importance compared to one who was the emissary of Jesus of Nazareth. Where Paul went, everywhere he went has become a famous place. There are shrines all over the Mediterranean world. Paul was here. Why is that? Because Paul acted on behalf of Christ. And if there's importance connected to anywhere Paul went, how much more is there importance connected to those places where Jesus was? We don't see it at the time. At the time, we look at things and we think, oh, I see what's important here, and I see what's not so important. And sometimes, really, we're clueless as to what's important and what isn't. And Luke, I think, is just kind of gently nudging us to recognize they had great pomp and great circumstance, but in the greater scheme of things, they were the paupers, and Paul was the king, as it were. All right, very quickly. Then Festus gave the order. Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa and all present here, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish community has petitioned me, shouting that he's done a bad thing. I have found that he's done nothing deserving death. But when he appealed to the Caesar, I decided to send him, but I have nothing definite to write to our sovereign about him. Therefore, I brought him to all of you, and especially to you, King Agrippa, so that when we have examined him, I'll have something to write. This is obviously Festus, I think, good faith interest here, to simply clarify what's going on. And then this great line, this is a wonderful line, of course, almost a classic statement, for it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner without indicating the charges against him. And Festus was feeling that great dilemma at that point. All right, so that's chapter 25. We're marching along here, and we got 4 more, let's see, 25, 26, 27, 3 more chapters. And so that's going to be it. Well, thank you all. I appreciate your being here. Let's close in prayer. Father, we're grateful that as we continue to see this story unfolding, we can see the way in which your hand, your sovereign providential care, was here with this apostle. And even though we recognize the great balance of power seemed to be all against Paul, that nevertheless, through the eyes of faith, we realize just the opposite, that your great care was upon him and your grace was giving potency to all that he said or did. We thank you that he models for us in such a remarkable way the life of faith. And we give you thanks that we've had an opportunity to review another little piece of that story in these moments together this morning. We ask your blessing on us now and give you thanks in the name of Jesus. Amen.